Hi there, everyone. Morphy here. I'm here with Godless Engineer.
What's up, heathens? How ya doing?
You're going to get that introduction in. We were talking a little bit before we came on about the fact that, at least for the moment, this is going to be my sort of penultimate interview. I may come back to it at a later date, but pressures of work and one thing and another, and also just people driving me nuts. And I just I was waiting for you to come on, I saw this tweet, and listen to this. Either the universe/life is a self-creating, or it was created by a creator. Okay, not sure whether that actually is a true dichotomy, but let's continue. All the signs of being created are there. Interesting. Free for all to see. Self-creating life is a far-fetched long shot. Now, this is the bit that actually drives me nuts. So improbable that math concludes it is impossible.
Yeah. A lot of Christian apologists love to claim that math would deem life to be impossible, but what they should really say is highly unlikely, which I would agree. It is highly unlikely, but given the amount of chances life has been given to arise, even just on Earth in general, I mean, it's inevitable that life would arise, because the probability of it arising isn't 0%. It's more than 0%. Even by a little bit, it's still more than 0%. So it's guaranteed to happen at some point, just given enough chances for it to happen.
Yeah. This is something that you and I, we've both got postgraduate degrees in mathematical subjects. And when I read that, I just go, no, math does not say that.
Yeah.
It just drives me absolutely crazy when people say things like this. Because, as you say, there's lots and lots of trials. And it's the example I always give. If we were playing bridge, so we deal a hand of 13 cards to 4 players, so all 52 cards go out, and you ended up with all of the diamonds, you'd go, oh, that's strange, but it's not got a different probability to any other hand.
Mm-hmm.
And if you got everybody in the world to continuously play bridge for years and years and years, that event is going to happen at some stage to somebody. And this is what we're talking about with an abiogenesis type event. We're talking about simultaneous trials that are not just taking place everywhere it was possible to happen here on Earth, but on every single planet in the entire universe where similar chemistry could go on. It's not beyond the bounds of probability that a very, very, very low probability event is going to happen eventually.
Right. Yeah, I think another good example would be to play off the whole YouTube aspect, like a YouTube aspect, and that's, now they're starting to really gauge how good your video is based on watch time. And like when you look at your watch time, it'll tell you that like you've got 2,000 hours watched on this one video. And it's not that like, sequentially people have watched your video, like it happens at like all at once, and then you immediately get the 2,000 hours because it all happened in parallel. And that's what a lot of these people don't understand, is that a lot of these interactions are happening in parallel, and then they're also happening in parallel across multiple segments of time. And that's what they just don't seem to understand, and how you can have trillions upon trillions of chemical reactions happening like every second, maybe, like in the early Earth. And all it takes is just that one time for it to happen, and then it'll happen at least that one time. So it's very interesting how they can't seem to grasp how statistics work, yet they try to use statistics for their own like narrative. It's very odd to me every time I hear it.
If we go back to your YouTube analogy, if somebody like that got this thing that you've had 2,000 hours of this video posted, and they look at it and go, oh, but you only posted it 2 days ago, there's not 2,000 hours since then. That's the thinking they're using.
Exactly. There hasn't been 2,000 hours yet. This is a lie.
It's absolutely crazy. And that's the sort of thing that's driving me nuts. There's another whole thread that's been going on between a couple of people, and the atheist in the conversation has got just this amazing level of patience that I haven't. And every time I log on to Twitter, there's like 20 odd tweets, and I just flick through them. And basically, the Christian guy keeps talking about the fact that numbers are abstract. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you can have 2 rocks, you can have 2 drink bottles, 2 mice, whatever you have 2 of. But then you've got the number 2, which can be dissociated from that. And somehow, because the actual number is an abstract idea, therefore God.
Well, see, normally when people bring that up for me, it's about how it's supposed to be an argument against materialism. Like they think that, well, a materialist thinks that the material world is all that exists. Well, numbers are abstract and don't technically exist in reality or something like that, or so some of the more abstract like ideas and thoughts, they don't exist materially, so therefore the supernatural must exist and therefore God must exist. That's generally the argument that I've heard, using numbers being abstract and that proving God. But I mean, one thing that I find is that they just don't understand how numbers are just numbers are just not prescriptive, but they're descriptive. And it's we're trying to describe what we're experiencing in reality when we use numbers and we use math and all that. So like when our understanding changes, then we change that description of our reality. And there's multiple ways where you could cite this as an example. Like in mathematics, we created vectors and all this other stuff in order to describe forces better. And so there's just multiple ways in which we've changed mathematics or our description so that we can better understand and represent our reality. And that's not to say that those things didn't, like those, like whatever underlying physical principles of reality didn't already exist. We just discovered them. But a lot of people have a tough time separating the nuance between our description of reality and the absolute truth of reality. A lot of times they want to convolute those two things.
Yeah, totally agreed. Seen that a few times. People saying that there was a recent debunk of something that William Lane Craig put out. William Lane Craig put out something about how mathematics describes the universe so well. That must be God. And right. Of course, you just gave a clear example with vectors that we developed vectors to describe things like force and displacement, velocity, right, and so on. And of course, it describes those things really, really well. And I mean, you've I think mentioned it in one of your videos recently. Tensors. That was kind of the point where I lost the plot at uni when I was doing general relativity and tensors came into it. Something that goes in more than one direction, all that sort of stuff. I found I could do the math, but the actual picturing of it was very difficult.
Yeah. Well, that was actually, I did a response to William Lane Craig's video. And he's sitting there acting like it's amazing how mathematics can describe reality. And I'm sitting there like, wait a second, we created mathematics specifically to do that. Why is this surprising? Because I mean, it's not surprising to anybody that understands mathematics even a little bit.
No. I think this is the problem with people weighing in on things that aren't their discipline. And it's interesting, Jordan Peterson weighing in on climate change recently, way outside his area of expertise. And I saw this brilliant comment actually from somebody. It was just underneath one of the videos that said, as a psychology professor, he must be well aware of the Dunning-Kruger effect, and yet he doesn't seem to think it applies to him.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, that guy Peterson. I mean, I really I like how he talks so much philosophical mumbo jumbo, that people end up being like, oh yeah, I totally understand what he's saying. And everybody else that can actually understand the concepts he's trying to talk about are like, the fuck is he saying?
Yeah, I love it. Okay, one of the first things I wanted to hit, and we've actually talked quite a bit already, but one of the first things was the mythicist position, because like you, I am a mythicist. It's not key to my not believing in Christianity or anything like that, though. I mean, if they actually came up with some evidence that it was a real dude walking around, it wouldn't to me, mean that all of the other claims about him were true. All the magical and,
No, I'm right there.
Yeah. So I used to be a mythicist in the sort of Aaron Ra sense, where Aaron Ra says if you had a time machine and you went back, you'd never, from the description we have of him in 2020, be able to actually find somebody who fitted the bill, fitted that criteria. So, but now I've read, like yourself, Carrier. I haven't read the Latasta book that you mentioned a few times, but I've read a lot of Carrier. I've read David Fitzgerald's stuff on this, and I just more and more think that they're basing their belief on something that's very, very flimsy.
Yeah, which I'm sure Lataster's book is good, but he's kind of made it inaccessible for common, I guess lay people that are not in the academic world to get it, because it's like $200 in order to buy the book, right? Ooh. So yeah, it's like it's targeted to the academia, so that like if you're going to college, this could be one of those books that a teacher uses in order to talk about like the historicity of Jesus or something like that. So Lataster is definitely targeting a totally different area of the market than like Carrier is, because Carrier, I mean, he's got his book on like Kindle, audiobook. I mean, if he could put it out on stone tablets, I'm sure he'd have them made on stone tablets. But they're just targeted to two different groups. But in any case, I would say that if we were to take a time machine back to the first century, we definitely wouldn't be able to pick this Jesus out of the crowd, mainly because we know that everything in the Gospels has been made up, either a total invention by the authors that created it, or it is pulled from the Old Testament. And so with those being completely made up stories, the only thing that you have left is Paul. When we look at Paul's Jesus, we really don't get a sense of who Jesus was prior to his supposed death, right? We know how he acted or the things he said after he died and resurrected, but we really don't know anything about what he possibly could have said prior to that, right? So I think Aaron Ross still right that, if we go back, we really wouldn't be able to pick Jesus up out of the lineup. But I still don't think that person that started Christianity didn't even exist. And I say that in definite terms, but it's really more most likely. Like I think he most likely didn't exist. And what I could ramble on and on about why I'm a mythicist, but what it comes down to is just that we don't have evidence that suggests that he actually did walk the earth. And a lot of people just automatically assume somebody existed first, and overcoming that generally is kind of hard, because obviously people existing is something that you can readily assume in general. But the problem is that we got a specific definition for Jesus. It's, this person that started the Jewish Christian cult that eventually flourished into Christianity. We would need to find a figure like that, and I just don't think that there was a central figure at the start of it to actually start the movement. I think that it was several different sects that were coming to the same conclusion, and it's just that one sect of Christians won out amongst all the others.
Yeah, I think most American evangelical Christians would think they could pick him out of a lineup, because he'd be the one blonde-haired, blue-eyed white dude in the lineup in the Middle East.
Yeah. Yeah, they really do. I mean, They think that Jesus is white and that he existed as a white man in Jerusalem. So, I mean, I think that they would be like, oh, yeah, sure. I'll just be able to pick him out of a lineup because he's the only white dude. No.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say, though. It wasn't that long ago that I think it was somebody called Thompson who proposed that maybe Moses and some of the other fathers of, Jewish religion and other religions were mythical, shall we say? And now that's pretty mainstream amongst historians. Really, it's only the religious types that think that Moses was actually a real dude.
Oh yes, definitely. The scholarly consensus on Moses, Abraham, Noah, all of the patriarchs of the Old Testament, they generally, or at least not the Old Testament in general, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, all of those patriarchs are generally thought to have not existed. But also that consensus wasn't established overnight, and I get a feeling that a lot of people think that consensuses are generally established like immediately. It's like somebody puts out a paper and immediately it's the consensus because it's the right thing. But that's not actually correct, because not only did the consensus about Moses take a long time to develop, but also back during the 60s or 70s, you had several scientists that were putting out like articles, like scientific peer-reviewed articles about how lead was not poisoning our environment and how lead was not causing health issues or anything like that. You had this scientific battle between the two, and the person that actually started fighting back, I mean, it took a long time for him to overcome the consensus of lead not affecting our environment. And so it's crazy to think that like a book like Carriers would be so
persuasive.
So persuasive that just immediately people are just like, oh, well, okay, I guess the consensus is turned now. Jesus didn't exist. Like, a lot of people have this idea that it should just immediately have like an effect on the community. But the problem is that for this particular community, for this particular topic, you have a lot of people that dogmatically hold on to certain beliefs, and it causes them to not look at the evidence objectively. It causes them, their bias is so strong that it actually causes them to admit that things are evidence when they're not really evidence. And there's several instances that I could bring up here of that happening. And it's just so crazy because like you were saying, a lot of Christian apologists now hold to the fact that Moses and Adam and Eve, for that matter, were physical people that actually existed in reality. And it's just simply not true.
Yeah. It's interesting. Have you come across, you must have done in your reading, the Raglan scale?
The rank Raglan?
The Raglan scale.
Yes. The rank Raglan scale. Yeah.
Yeah. I brought that up in the midst of a Twitter debate about the fact that the highest score on the Raglan scale is Oedipus, which is somebody we actually know was mythical. Scores 21 out of 22, and the next two highest are Moses and Jesus at 20 out of 22. Right. And somebody came back with, that scale's being completely debunked. Abraham Lincoln scores 14 on the scale or something like that. Well, I know that no real person who actually existed scores more than 7, and Alexander the Great was the highest of those. So when we dug down on it a bit, there's my friend Lilith who did a bit of digging on it. First of all, she actually got all the details of Abraham Lincoln, put it up against the scale, and found that he only scored 4. But there's some Christian apologist out there who's obviously spreading this, lies about the Raglan scale and about how it applies to Abraham Lincoln. And first of all, there's just that, and then there's the point that if they've got the truth, why do they feel the need to lie?
Yeah, you would think that. Like, I mean, there have been several apologists that have been caught in lying, on this particular subject. Well, either lying or just so woefully misunderstanding the evidence that their bias is preventing them from actually correcting their mistakes. I don't know exactly which one it is, but like with the Raglan scale, a lot of times it's taken as like this is a piece of evidence that shows that Jesus definitely didn't exist in history or something like that. But that's really not the point of the Rank-Raglan scale in a mythicist type of argument. In a mythicist argument, bringing up the Rank-Raglan scale is just to show how parsimonious Jesus, being one of these classical hero figures, is. And it's supposed to give you the indication that, well, he matches all of these things that are common to classical heroes that we find in history. So, I mean, this should cause us to doubt a lot of this, and I mean, like, I don't even know if you could actually apply the Rank-Raglan scale to a minimal historical figure of Jesus, right? The Rank-Raglan scale is actually targeted to the gospel version of Jesus because that's really the only place that you find enough details, on the list for it to even apply. The Pauline version of Jesus, I really don't know if you could honestly apply it to his version of Jesus, because like Paul's not concerned with his birth. He's not concerned with anything really but his death. So, I mean, I think that Paul's Jesus would, I guess, probably score better on the Rank-Raglan, but still, that's not an indication of whether or not he existed. It's just an indication on as to whether or not he matches other classical heroes in history.
Yeah. Something else that you mentioned as well reminded me that about a year ago, Bart Ehrman was on Waking Up with Sam Harris, or Making Sense as he calls it now, and Sam Harris asked him about the mythicist position. And Ehrman's response was, oh no, we've got plenty of evidence. For example, we have historian, name escaping me at the moment, Josephus.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have Josephus. And that just struck me immediately as being incredibly weak, because the two mentions that I know about in Josephus, one of them is hotly disputed as to whether or not it's actually a much later forgery. And the other one doesn't seem to apply to that Jesus at all, just somebody else called Jesus.
Well, yeah. So, in the first reference called the Testimonium Flavianum, there's a lot of scholarly debate around that, and I think that there's a solid case for it to not have even been there in the first place. So the Testimonium Flavianum is definitely not a solid piece of evidence to actually point to. But, I mean, you could have arguments over the structure of that particular paragraph, where it's at in Josephus's writings, how Josephus uses verbs, how, no earlier version of the Testimonium Flavianum actually exists. Well, the only version that we have comes from Eusebius. So, I mean, you could have that extensive discussion on it, but it's really just going to come down to if you honestly represent the information like about the attacks on the consensus. And I really haven't seen anybody honestly answer the attacks on it with anything other than just marking it as irrelevant, right? They act like, oh, that's not evidence that it wasn't written by him or something like that. They generally always appeal to consensus, which is kind of funny. But the James reference that you mentioned, which is the second reference to it, has a lot of different problems. You're right that it's talking about a completely different Jesus, at least what we think originally was there, because there is a part of it that says who was called Christ, but that reads more like a marginal note. Plus, later on in the passage, it talks about a completely different Jesus being put into James, the person that died, his position. And so, like, Josephus doesn't go through and explain who this Jesus is, who that Jesus is, or anything like that, other than at the very beginning as relating Jesus, who was called Christ, to James, we don't know who this other Jesus is. Jesus ben Damnius, we would assume is James ben Damnius's brother or whatnot. But we just don't understand like why Josephus would just bring them up without any kind of explanation. There's also no explanation as to what a Christ is. Josephus doesn't refer back to the Testimonium Flavianum, for one. For two, if there was no Testimonium Flavianum, we would definitely expect Josephus to actually explain what a Christ is to his audience, who wouldn't know what a Christ is. So there's a lot of problems with the Josephus passages as evidence, and this is sourced in academia right now. I mean, Richard Carrier has he's got a paper on Tacitus. I don't think that he wrote a paper on Josephus. Maybe I can't remember if he's got a paper on Josephus, but he definitely goes through all the evidence against Josephus and on the historicity of Jesus.
Yeah, there's two things that actually come out of that. First of all, you mentioned Eusebius, and he's actually well known as a source of several forgeries. So the finger definitely points there. And secondly, it just, Bart Ehrman is somebody I've watched a lot of, and the guy is incredibly knowledgeable. He's a great scholar. I've watched him debate. He really knows his stuff, and it just seems to me that this is an incredibly weak piece of evidence for him to put out there.
Well, Raphael Lataster, in his newest book that's targeted towards academia, he actually analyzes Bart Ehrman's work, and what he notices is that the books and things that he published around the time of his book, Did Jesus Exist?, which is a pop level book that's not peer reviewed at all. All of the works that he published around that one work are completely different quality than Did Jesus Exist? And so if it seems like he normally is right on the money about things, and then it seems to be incredibly weak about the historicity of Jesus, I think that there's still a lot of Christian bias that's working there. I think that the way that he possibly was taught about New Testament history and all that kind of stuff, I think that maybe that's kind of getting in the way. At least that's what it seems like to me. Obviously, I'm not an expert or anything like that, but I'm just saying that with the way that he's on, he's spot on in his other works, but then he just is surprisingly weak in Did Jesus Exist? It kind of seems to be that way to me. But again, like I said, I'm not an expert or anything like that, so it may not be my place to say, but it just that seems to be the case for me.
Yeah, I think neither of us are actually experts in this area. We both have advanced degrees in completely different area. So we're doing a Jordan Peterson here.
Well, I mean, I think that there's I don't know. I guess it could be kind of like Jordan Peterson, but like I'm not forming any of these arguments on my own, right? I don't know if Jordan Peterson is forming his arguments on his own, or if he's getting his arguments from like the anti-climate change kind of scholars and scientists that are out there. But I know that for me, it's not like I'm coming up with these arguments. These are arguments that are made in the peer-reviewed literature. And so I'm basically just regurgitating what the peer-reviewed literature says about each topic. So I don't really have to be like an expert in this field to understand the arguments that are made against the consensus. And that's one thing that I really want to get across to people, is that you don't need to be an expert in this field just to understand like the professional, peer-reviewed, scholarly arguments put forth by several people out there, including Thomas Brody, Richard Carrier, Raphael Lataster, and crap, I'm blanking on a third name here.
Hector Avalos?
Huh?
Avalos,
yes. Hector Avalos. I had his face in my head, but I couldn't get his name out. There's Dr. Robert Price too. So you really don't have to be an expert in the field. You just got to be able to understand what the experts are saying.
Yeah, that's a good point. You had a phone call from somebody who was, wanting to prove the historicity a little while ago. I don't know if you remember your call, and he was citing Tacitus, who you've already mentioned.
Yeah.
So
well,
what's the situation there?
Well, Tacitus is an incredibly weak argument because even if you take Tacitus at face value, which is what the apologists want to do, it really only gets you back to the 64 CE when the Rome was burning, right? And Nero blamed the Christians according to Tacitus. So, I mean, really, it only gets you to Christians existing in 64 CE. No mythicists out there would really fight against that idea. But it goes a long way to it's a long way from proving that Jesus existed in history. At most, it could just be regurgitating what Christians believe in 64 CE. So, considering that the Gospels were written right after that, the understanding of the Gospels would have existed prior to them being written down. So it's quite likely that it could have just been Christians at the time that were saying that. But you also have to consider when Tacitus was writing, because he was writing in the 2nd century. So that the particular part that's highly Christianized in Tacitus is particularly just talking about what's found in the Gospels, and so that would have most likely come from 2nd century Christians. So, I mean, any way in which you go about using Tacitus, you really just end up back at the Gospels.
Yeah. Interesting fact that I picked up just the other day. There was no way that Nero actually fiddled while Rome burned, because apparently he played the lyre, not the fiddle. So yeah, he certainly wasn't very nice to Christians, though, was he?
No, but there are conflicting reports surrounding the burning of Rome. Like, Tacitus is the only one that really cites Nero as blaming the Christians. There are several other different accounts as to where Nero was during the burning of Rome and who he blamed for the burning of Rome. So, I mean, the nuances of that particular discussion, I mean, you could go all day about, but ultimately, when you get down to it, Tacitus really just puts Christians in 64 CE at Rome, and that's no surprise.
Yeah. There was one more point on this. You mentioned consensus a few times, and I think people need to understand that there's a big difference between a consensus on something like this and, say, a consensus on something like climate change.
Right.
Or indeed anything scientific, because so many people who are working in the field of Jesus studies, or theology in general, have to sign statements of faith to actually hold their jobs. So, an example would be, was it Mike Licona who got the sack from his job just simply for saying that he didn't think there was literally, graves popping open and zombies running all over the place when Jesus was crucified.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of control that happens in this particular area, and that's why it's regularly painted as secularists or atheists who take a look at the evidence from outside of the field of experts who are Christians and who are controlling the consensus. They usually like to paint them as just crazy loons and everything like that. But in fact, like Richard Carrier's position, the minimal mythicist position is not crazy because it's all based in evidence that we have, and nobody has actually mounted an attack on Carrier's work, at least not in a complete fashion. None of them really want to engage in the topic. They all just feel like, well, if we ignore it and we don't engage with it, then it'll just die out and nothing will become of it, which I guess could happen if we don't constantly push back on them. And the fact that the consensus is controlled by Christians, it's no wonder that it's going to be very, very hard in order to change the consensus. And whenever somebody cites the consensus to me, I just roll my eyes so hard, because obviously the consensus says this: I'm pushing back against the consensus by attacking their evidence. So now we have to start looking at what the actual evidence is, not just citing consensus. And that's what that one caller seemed to not be able to get past. But again, like you were saying, the consensus on some fact in biblical New Testament studies is vastly different than the hard science of like climate change or the shape of our earth, even. Because those things are what we would consider to be hard science. Those are things that we have hard evidence for or against. While history is, you could label it like a soft science, because we don't have hard evidence from back then. Like we have anecdotal evidence, and sometimes we have hard evidence that can solidify things. But for the most part, what you're dealing with is accounts from people that were written down, or different incidental facts that all line up and make something highly plausible. Not that something 100% happened in history. And so I think that's where a lot of people get confused at, is that they confuse history with these more hard sciences that we have actual evidence for and against positions on.
Yeah. Okay, moving on from mythicism, maybe we want to tag in the video where we start talking about mythicism for people who are sick about it. But there's one of your, it was kind of one of the commentaries you do on somebody else's video. There was a German guy talking about he doesn't know how atheists can actually have meaning in their life. Mm-hmm. And this strikes me as just really weak, the sort of thing that people say who don't understand what it is to be an atheist. I had a discussion with a former student a couple of weeks ago where he was telling me that everybody has this God-shaped hole in them. And I'm like, I don't. I just don't. I've never been religious. And what you're describing is just something I just don't have. So anyway, I'll let you take that for a moment. And if I pick up on anything, I'll jump in.
Right. Well, the whole idea of a God-shaped hole in somebody always makes me laugh, because, like, I don't know. I get weird pictures in my head of people walking around with, like, I don't know, a giant hole in their chest or something. It's like, oh, you're missing God today? Yeah, just couldn't get him in there. Kind of thing. But yeah, so the misunderstanding that guy had came from the idea that, if the universe itself doesn't really have meaning to it, then things that are contained within the universe also don't have meaning. He thinks that there's a strict delineation, or that there can't be a delineation from the parts of something compared to the whole. Like in a discussion that I had with him, I described it as like the universe being a blue matte like image, but that doesn't mean that every single pixel inside that is like a blue pixel. Like there could be red scattered throughout it, and it doesn't really change the ultimate image that's rendered, right? I use that as kind of a really simple comparison, but his fundamental misunderstanding is that he thinks that the universe has to have meaning in order for we to have meaning that exists in the universe. And I just really don't see a reason why we have to make that like a primary axiom of our understanding of the universe. I don't understand why the parts of the whole have to have the exact same properties as the whole. I think that they can have their own individual properties, as their own independent parts, right? And so he just, for me at least, he failed to establish that connection between the entire universe having a meaning and us individually having a meaning. And we were just I had a conversation with him like somewhat face to face, over the internet, and he just we kept talking past each other, and he just couldn't grasp what I was talking about. I mean, I understood what he was talking about, I just disagreed, and he just didn't seem to understand that.
Yeah, I suppose in a way he's committing a fallacy of composition.
Yes, I was trying to point out to him how he was doing that without actually using that term, but he seemed to be steadfast and not realizing it.
I just I don't get this. I know that in the past you have been religious and you've come out of it, but I've never been, and I've always had something that I get out of bed in the morning to do. So I care about education. I care about animals, and I look after rescue animals. It's something that I do, and I care about exercise. I exercise every day, and there's all sorts of things that I care about and want to do during my day. I don't need a God for that. The meaning is actually given to me. I've got up this morning and I've got a program of events that I'm going to do today, and some of them are things that I deeply want to do, and other things are just I'm going to have some downtime and watch some Netflix. And I've got family. I love my family. I like to spend time with my family. This is just the human condition to me. It's nothing to do with a God.
Right. I feel the exact same way. I mean, I give myself meaning. Even religious people, they seem to give themselves meaning all the time. Even if that meaning is just praising God and doing everything for God, they are the ones that are assigning themselves that meaning. It's not some God that assigns it for them. But for some reason, guys like the one that we're talking about, as well as other apologists, they seem to think that it's not worth anything, or it doesn't actually mean anything unless something outside of ourselves assigns that meaning to us or intrinsically gives us that meaning. And they do this in an ad hoc sense, just without any kind of evidence or any reason to suggest that we need, that to be the case in order for our lives to have meaning. And it's that kind of non secular type of logic that you'll find is rampant in Christian apologetics.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, I don't suppose there's much more to say about that. We all have meaning in our lives. I mean, if we live our 70 years and 10 or whatever, it's going to be really hard to get up every morning and not have things that you want to do. And that's just
Yeah, I think generally everybody feels like they don't have enough time to do all the things that they want to do.
Yeah. So, yeah, that for sure is true. And, we were talking a little bit before we came on, and obviously I'm a lot closer to retirement than you are, but I really hope that at some stage you were telling me about the things that you really want to spend time on, and at some stage I really hope that you can do that full time, and that would be wonderful if you could. If you actually were a Christian apologist, you'd have no trouble getting the money to do it.
Yeah.
Because that was another tweet the other week that I saw. Somebody was saying about atheists are getting paid to discredit religion and stuff like that. But I want my check. Where's my check?
Yeah, I know. Hey, as we always say in the Skeptic Mafia, check is always in the mail.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, another talk that you had, and this is a young man who's also been on my friend Peter's channel, the Gonna Go For It channel, Guzman, who seems to be popping up all over the place at the moment. And he has just swallowed the Young Earth Creationist textbook whole, without any critical thought whatsoever, if you ask me. And the very first thing that he said was about the Earth's magnetic field, which is actually my area of postgraduate study. So I knew immediately he is talking absolute shit. He's talking about a pattern that's been seen over the last 200 years. Well, the magnetic field, we've got all this record in the rocks and stuff about how it's changed and fluctuated and reversed polarity over the course of billions of years. We actually know what's happened at different times in the past with it. I mean, we haven't got a complete Truman Show type picture of it, but we know that it's changed and fluctuated, and sometimes it's been stronger. Eventually it is going to disappear because of course it relies on the fluid core to get the dynamo effect. But we know the thing's a dynamo, and I actually produced a self-consistent dynamo as part of my thesis. It only lasted a couple of seconds as a self-consistent dynamo, but hey, at the time that's what computing power could do. We know that that's rubbish, and you don't have to go far. You just need to go to Talk Origins or somewhere like that, and that stuff is all thoroughly debunked by many papers. So that was his start point, and then he got onto other stuff like dodo soft tissue, which I know that you've looked up since, and I saw you did a video about that. So perhaps you could take that from there.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, I knew about dinosaur soft tissues prior to that. What I didn't know about was whatever finds Mark Armitage had found. And what it turned out to be was exactly what I predicted it to be, just either a misunderstanding or misrepresentation of the actual evidence that was found. Because what Mark Armitage found was osteocyte-like cells and, just other cells and vessel-like, cell-like and vessel-like portions that he found under the microscope. And so he misrepresents that and interprets it as soft tissue. And because it's not really soft tissue, these are more like shadows of these things that exist in this fossil, not the actual things. There are some organic compounds that have been known to survive in the very centers of the fossils that have been recovered, but that's very, very far from actual soft tissue that they would like to present. So in that debate, we were debating on whether or not dinosaurs lived recently, and he spent an enormous amount of time talking about dinosaur bone beds. And he focused a lot on the flood events that happened, and he totally disregards the idea of multiple floods happening, or he disregards the idea of any naturalistic possibility of why these animals got buried the way that they did. And he favors this idea of a global flood that happened in stages. But the problem is that we don't see any animals that traverse different portions of the geological column. So, like, for instance, we don't have some kind of animal that's climbing its way up the geological column. They're all nicely laid down in these different layers, and we can date the layers by the rock that's in there or by some crystals that might have formed in there. There's different ways in which we can date these layers, but basically in the geologic column, we don't have any fossils that are out of place. And this is totally antithetical to the idea that a global flood happened. He wants to go with the creationist apologists / scientists that have produced peer-reviewed papers, which really, I mean, the real scientific journals are not publishing creationist propaganda. It's all their own creation research groups and stuff that publish the material, and so there's not really any kind of peer review that happens, at least from what I can tell. Again, I'm not an expert in the field. I don't review scientific papers put out in this particular area professionally or anything like that. So take it for what you will, but it just seems like a bunch of creationists are stroking their own egos by forming their own journals and publishing the information that they want people to know.
The sad thing about this is, having seen this kid talk a few times, I don't think he's an idiot. He's actually a pretty smart kid who's just got all these bad ideas infecting his thought processes.
Oh, yeah, I would definitely not classify him as an idiot. I think some of the things he says are idiotic, but I don't think that he himself is necessarily an idiot. He's part of the new independent fundamentalist Baptist group. And so they've been labeled as, well, they haven't been labeled as a hate group because there's not a centralized group, really. They've been labeled as sort of a hate movement. This would include types like Steven Anderson and Matt Powell. And so they're definitely sort of a hate movement that's been forming in the fundamentalist section of Christianity.
So I'm really glad you mentioned Matt Powell. but
I can guess what you're going to bring up.
Okay. Well, my first... I know that you did a commentary on the Matt Powell... was it a sermon a few weeks ago? But my first 4 videos that I did were about a discussion that Matt Powell had with Jackson Wheat. And it was just bizarre. And you remember that look that David Silverman had when he was on with, Tide Goes In, Tide Goes Out. And he just had that look on his face. And Jackson had this exact same look on his face. Yeah, that so many times you just think Jackson, somebody just whacked Jackson in the face with a 2x4 because he just had that, what? Could not believe what Matt Powell was saying. And Matt Powell came out with stupid stuff like, atheists think that at one time the sun was bigger than the universe, because how else could it have been burning away all this time and still only be the size that it is? And he actually said so many things about the fact that he actually thinks it's burning. Another point, he said something about, how does it burn? Because the air in space is different. And it's like, do you actually think that the sun is made of a fossil fuel? Is it made of coal and it's burning in oxygen? What the fuck do you actually think?
Oh man, I have got to find this particular conversation between Matt Powell and Jackson Wheat. This is too good. I mean, did you see? Like, I had him on my channel and I talked to him, in an interview style, and he said that he claimed that Confederate soldiers shot down pterodactyls. You've got to watch that interview one day, because my face just says it all. I'm just sitting there like, it really had me dumbfounded that he thought this. And he's like, you can go out there and search it. It's on the internet. There are pictures. And so then I cut in on the interview. I cut in with his evidence. And it's an obviously fake photo that apparently was done up for some TV show, I think maybe in the UK or something. And he thinks it's real. So
I did some calculations about, if the sun was actually made of coal, and the amount of energy it puts out, and you'd actually be able to see the shrinkage. You'd be able to look at it one day and look at it a week later, it'd be different.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
I mean,
Absolutely
I really
crazy.
don't expect Matt Powell to understand what nuclear fusion is.
No, Jackson was actually trying to say to him, but it's not burning, it's nuclear fusion, and that was just met with just silence. Matt Powell obviously did not know about fusion.
Yeah, so the sermon that I recently reviewed of his, he tried to suggest that it was common, the common scientific idea about squids and octopi was that they hitched a ride on meteorites and then crash landed here on Earth, which totally neglects everything that we know about squids and octopi and everything. So, I mean, it was a harebrained thing to put in a scientific article, right? And it was heavily criticized after it was published. There's no reason for Matt Powell to represent that as like the common scientific consensus or something that quote unquote evolutionists are teaching. Basically what it comes down to is Matt Powell just half-ass attempts to read these scientific articles, and he just finds whatever he can use against evolution, and then he presents that as the popular belief among all scientists. And it's only through this kind of dishonesty that he can really push his own narrative of creationism.
This was brought up in a debate that Jackson Wheat had just last week on Modern Day Debates. Mm-hmm. Somebody was talking about the octopus and squid type situation and saying, but you've got no ancestors for those. And Jackson actually had the phylogenetic tree on the, and he's saying, yeah, look here, we can see where they go.
They're right here, motherfucker.
It's just. Yeah,
I'm sorry. I keep cursing. I don't know if that's really allowed on.
I often announce that Morph is a family show, but I'm fucking joking when I say that. but yeah, why anybody would quote Matt Powell, who's such a demonstrable, complete fucking fruitcake idiot as anything. And like you say, if he's associated with Stephen Anderson and all those people who seem to think that members of the LGBTQI community should be, euthanized by the government and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
I personally think that they should be, but anyway, it just, I don't know. It's really sad, and hopefully, I mean, he's only a young lad, and hopefully one day he'll wake up and become a strong voice against those sort of people. So yeah, that's what I'm hoping.
Yeah.
Okay, Godless Engineer. Who's this an impression of? Oh, what do you mean? I just refuted your point because I gave you a quote from Frank Turek.
Let me see. Is this Praise I Am That I Am?
That's so exactly who that was.
Yeah, he really loves the quotes, doesn't he? I mean, he thinks that he can refute everybody with just quotes from scholars or important people, and he doesn't understand that you've actually got to interact with the evidence or the arguments, not just quote people. And I find it hilarious that anytime I've debated or talked to him, he just brings out several different quotes, and it's like, but this guy says this. Oh, okay. Well, I don't care.
Yeah, I made some notes. I was watching that debate, and just amongst the things that he doesn't seem to know, he certainly doesn't seem to know any logical fallacies.
No, that's because he's primarily composed of logical fallacies.
Yeah, he doesn't know what a straw man is.
No,
because he kept accusing you of straw manning him when all you were doing was just repeating what his position was. I mean, his position is difficult to steel man, but you certainly weren't straw manning it.
Yeah.
He doesn't know what a paradox is.
No, I would not say that he knows what a paradox is. That's for sure.
Yeah. He just constantly made assumptions about things that that I don't think you can just assume, and you actually need to back it with some evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I've got citations from people who basically were saying batshit things, and he was using their quotes as meaning something.
Well, yeah, and see the problem with that, like, there's a difference. There's definitely a difference in like citing where you got some argument or information, and primarily using the fact that somebody said something as your evidence. It's a little bit of a nuance, and I've even fallen into the issue of mistaking it as an argument from authority before. But obviously, what Praise I Am That I Am does is he specializes in making arguments from authority. He just quotes people who are saying things that he agrees with without actually interacting with the actual arguments or any rebuttal that's brought up to him. I know in our last discussion, he accused me of falling into presentism, and that's basically where you import like present day requirements for different qualities of evidence into like ancient historical sources and everything like that. Like, basically he was saying that I was expecting ancient historians to follow common practices that we presently have in place, but that's not at all like what I was doing, and he just didn't seem to understand the difference.
Yeah, I made a note of that, about the fact he kept mentioning modern criterion, and it seems to me that when historians do this sort of work, they don't impose the same sorts of rigor to what we would expect from nowadays. But if we were doing what Carrier advocates with ancient history, and we were actually doing an analysis, a mathematical analysis, Bayesian, that's what I was looking for. We were doing a Bayesian analysis. We would still have to assign the evidence as it is a lower prior probability, because it doesn't, it would lower our priors for that type of evidence.
Yeah.
And he seemed to think without saying it, because I don't suppose the guy can do any math whatsoever. But he seemed to suggest that just because it's ancient and it's different, we should assign it the same type of prior probability.
Right. Yep, that's exactly what he thinks. I mean, he literally thinks that miracles don't have a low prior probability. Like, he thinks that miracles have 100% prior probability, basically, is what I can glean from him. So he obviously doesn't really understand like how humans regularly predict what will happen in the future if they commit some action or if some action occurs. Which is kind of a simple version of what we're hoping to do with Bayesian analysis, because what you're hoping to do with Bayesian analysis is you take the prior probability of something happening and then you multiply it by the probability that the evidence that you have means that it happened, and then you divide it by the the total amount, right, to get your percentage. Which that's probably a really bad way to explain Bayesian reasoning. But basically what it comes down to is you take your prior probability and you use that to sort of justify how likely it is an event occurred, given the evidence that we have. And I don't think that Standing for Truth really understands how to do that. And I'm not trying to call him stupid or ignorant or anything like that. I just think that he actually hasn't given it any thought.
Yeah, we were talking about praise rather than Standing for Truth. He's a whole other story.
Did I say standing? I meant praise. They're so similar. I'm so sorry.
They've all got their own little shtick, haven't they? That they bang on about. I did a whole thing about standing in my discussion with Erica. The first few minutes, I did this whole thing about, but Dr. Nathaniel Jensen says this, and Dr. Nathaniel Jensen says that, and did you know the cover of his book is blue and it's got a butterfly on it, and all this sort of stuff. That was my, and every time I listen to Standing for Truth, and he's saying Dr. Nathaniel Jensen, I always hear Dr. Daniel Jackson, the guy from Stargate. So I did this whole thing about Dr. Daniel Jackson decoded the glyphs on the Stargate so that we could go all over the universe, and for some reason he had to help MacGyver get through the Stargate because so I did this whole thing about him. We were talking about praise. Carrier does a whole thing about the prior probabilities for miracles in proving history.
Yep.
And he's not saying that he's just discounting miracles because they're miracles and because he doesn't believe in them because he's an atheist. He actually compares the number of claims that we can't verify with the total number of claims of miracles that we can debunk, which are huge. And so he's just saying, okay, let's suppose these ones that we can't verify are true, and we divide it by the number of ones that we've been able to debunk. That's a low probability.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, again, I don't think praise I don't think Standing gets it either. I don't think he actually knows any genetics, let alone anything else.
Neither of them know the particular areas in which they defend.
Yeah. Jackson was making that point actually when he was on with Erica on Going to Go For It a few weeks back, and he said, if you can get them off their script, they don't know. They don't actually, Standing doesn't know any genetics and so on. But there's a whole load of these guys. You catch them on the Modern Day Debate channel. There's a Mr. Batman and various other people, and they've all got their own little shtick, and it's all somehow one little part of the God of the gaps, and they just bang on and on and on about it. And very often it's not a gap. Very often we actually have an answer to it.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. I did the same thing with Praise I Am That I Am in my discussion about the historical Jesus with him, because I tried to get him off track by actually trying to get him to engage in the evidence. And because that wasn't part of his script, he didn't know how to attack it. At one point in the discussion, he was actually confused as to what evidence was. And so it's kind of mind-blowing the link, like what you can get them to admit to once they're off their script.
Yeah, Yeah, absolutely. And it's a bit like the guy I was talking to you about on Twitter, who, with the numbers being abstract, therefore God. Every now and again, I just keep interjecting into this discussion. So, how do numbers being abstract get us to zombie Jew? And how do these nefarious ideas you keep discussing get us to get around all of the discrepancies in the Gospels? And
it would be amazing if they could actually make that connection, huh?
Yeah. One last thing, a recent one of yours again. I was watching, I was kind of listening to it yesterday, so I didn't pick it all up because I was working as well. But there was a discussion about evolution, and somehow evolution led to Hitler, and understanding or teaching evolution is bad because it's going to cause bad things to happen. Now, to me, that is just an argument from consequences. And, even if everybody believing in evolution was the worst thing that could possibly happen to the human race, to me, it would still be true.
Well, yeah. I think that regardless of the consequences, I think that we need to believe more true things than more false things, I believe, as Matt Dillahunty generally says. I think that, whatever consequences may happen don't affect the truth value of it. So I would definitely agree with you on that.
Yeah. And you brought up about all the things that have been done in the name of religion over the years. And I always go to the Crusades.
Yeah, I mean that's a good one. I generally only bring those up during arguments about morality and the idea that Christians are inherently good or that atheists are inherently bad. Mainly because you can't sit there and say, well, being a Christian inherently makes you moral when Christians have regularly committed atrocities in the past. You have to be able to interact with that. And generally what I find is that these apologists will say that, well, they weren't really Christian, or they didn't really understand the gospel, or they didn't really do this or that. And so they in effect become not real Christians to them. And only recently in the recent denominations that have come forth have we attained God's true message and true way to be. But even then, that's highly debatable, even amongst Christians themselves. Otherwise, why would other denominations exist? Why would so many denominations exist? So, I mean, during a conversation of morality, I think it's important, like those would be things like the Crusades or Hitler or anything like that. Those would be important to bring up because I think that people need to interact with those particular sore spots in the past.
Yeah, so they've gone from argument from consequences to no true Scotsman in one jump. But this is the point where I normally show them that my logical fallacy bingo card and shout house.
That's a good move. Bingo! I won. Shit,
Yes.
What did I win? A wasted night? Fuck me.
Yeah. I mean, could you imagine? I forget who it was who first made this point, actually, but I did see it somewhere. Could you imagine what would have happened if the Crusaders had had modern assault rifles and logistics?
That would just be ridiculous. I think that there would have been a lot more bloodshed back then. I mean, it would be so scary if we had a president that was so deluded in religious ideology that he was having our troops attacking someplace just because he thinks it's holy or just because he thinks God wants him to. I think that when you add religion to things, it can make people do a lot of horrible things. It allows people to justify horrible actions with God's wants and needs. So I think that it would be a horrible thing if that particular situation happened.
I've thought of one last question for you. I know we've been going for a while, but one last question. When did this comes from seeing Pastor Greg Locke again this morning. He's such a nice chap. And when did being a Christian become synonymous with not caring about other people's welfare, not wearing a mask in public, and just basically being an arsehole about a disease like COVID?
I really don't know, because in the past, I mean, you've had Christian apologists use the apologetic of, well, Christian people are just more philanthropic, or Christian people help out their community, whereas atheists seem to not help out anybody. But then with the COVID situation, it seems the tables have turned, and now it's the Christians that just don't care about their fellow man, which I don't know if they understand how masks work or how we need to protect each other, but definitely the compassion for each other that Christians regularly, spout. I feel like that's definitely in question now, because a lot of these people that are Trump supporters, that are maskers, they're highly religious, and for them to be that way and to continue to spread the disease, I think that they really have to reconsider, the whole idea that Christians just care about people, because it's obviously that they don't care about their fellow human. At least the ones that are very anti-mask and think that it's a political game, to wear a mask and all this other stuff. There's you can see signs that are being floated around, which I don't know if the person was a Christian or not, but I would say that considering most of the United States is religious in some aspect, it's very likely that the person that was holding the Sacrifice the Week, poster was actually religious in some fashion. So, I mean,
Yeah.
I think that it has to come under serious scrutiny.
Yeah, I always made the comment that the person holding the Sacrifice the Week banner, that I was going to bet a lot of money that she was actually a pro-lifer.
It's kind of funny to see people that are pro-life and then are like, I ain't going to wear a mask. Oh, but I thought you were pro-life, dude.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, I'm going to, at this stage, thank you very much for joining me. I've really enjoyed this discussion. It's been great. I've been watching your videos for years, and it's always good to actually catch up and talk to somebody who I've watched for a number of years. So Thank you very much for your time.
No, yeah, definitely. I've had a great time talking to you about all this stuff. It's usually hard to get me to stop talking.
That's fine. I'm quite happy to just ask questions and let somebody go. That's great. So, well, thank you for your time, and we'll speak again.